Here's Alex O'Connor to explain to Ben Shapiro why his arguments for God are silly.
Listen, there's no way to blame people who don't believe in God because they've experienced enormous amounts of personal pain. God is apart from human beings, and if we understood the mind of God, then we would be like God in his totality, which we are not. That does not mean that you're not feeling the pain that you are feeling. It doesn't mean you don't have a right to feel angry at God. But understand that the struggle with God is a part of religion itself. Being a religious believer is the consistent struggle with the logic of the universe.
It's a consistent struggle with logic itself. How is this not an admission that his religion makes no sense?
And that seems to me a deeper and more fulfilling struggle than simply pretending the universe has no meaning at all.
What do you mean by meaning? Do you mean purpose? How do you conclude that the universe has a purpose? And why would failing to see any such purpose be pretending?
Being a religious believer is the consistent struggle with the logic of the universe. And that seems to Ben, quote, a more fulfilling struggle than simply pretending that the universe has no meaning at all. Why would being a religious believer be a, quote, struggle with the logic of the universe?
Because theism is not logical and Ben knows it. He understands that his religion makes no sense, and instead of rejecting it like a rational person, he would prefer to live under a worldview that he knows makes no sense.
As if the logic of the universe doesn't naturally point to God, and this is instead something we have to effort to make consistent with our observations of the universe.
God isn't just inconsistent with our observations of the universe. The concept is internally inconsistent as well. For example, a being can't be both all-powerful and perfectly good, because a perfectly good being would not just abstain from evil. It would be altogether inconceivable for a morally perfect being to even be capable of evil. If God is capable of evil but simply never commits it, then God is only incidentally good rather than essentially good.
How much suffering it contains, how absent God constantly appears to be from it. Ben has already done some of the work for the atheist in pointing out that being religious is a struggle. And not just because of the social implications or whatever, but because of the very, quote, logic of the universe, the struggle against which Ben says is integral to religious belief.
Integral to his religious beliefs, for sure.
But also consider that Ben said he finds this a, quote, deeper and more fulfilling struggle than simply pretending the universe has no meaning at all. It may well be deeper and more meaningful or fulfilling to you, Ben, but that of course works in favor of the atheist too. It implies that at least part of the reason why you choose theism over atheism is not because of reason or argument, but simply because you find it more meaningful and deeper.
Ben is making an argument ad consequentiam. He is, ironically, putting the feelings of fulfillment over whether his beliefs are factual.
Of course, this is exactly what the atheist thinks accounts for religious belief in the first place. Man's desperate effort to invent purpose and meaning where it doesn't exist, to make themselves feel better about being stuck in the human condition.
That seems to be the case for a lot of theists. It seems to be the case for Ben, certainly, and also for William Lane Craig, who says that he lowers his doxastic standards with respect to Christianity because he so desperately wants it to be true. That's why people call him Low Bar Bill now.
Thanks for admitting it, I guess. Ben then assumes that atheism and nihilism are the same thing by saying that the opposite of being a religious believer is asserting that the universe has no meaning at all.
I don't think the universe has any objective meaning, even if there is a God. If we take meaning to mean purpose, it's never clear to me what theists intend to convey when they use that word. Then even if there is a God who created the universe to serve some purpose, there is still no objective, non-circular reason why we ought to adopt God's purposes as our own.
Now, it may well be a defensible position that atheism should entail nihilism, but Ben's sort of smuggled in the meaninglessness there by conflating the two as if they're the same thing. But don't worry, because bizarrely, Ben also implies that nihilists are only pretending to be nihilists.
What would even be the motivation for pretending such a thing? Does Ben believe, like the Christian apologists do, that we only claim to not believe in God because we want to sin? Why would we need to pretend that there is no God in order to sin? Theists sin all the time. They clearly don't need to deny that God exists in order to do so, so what advantage is there to saying you don't believe in God when you really do?
For him, struggling with the logic of the universe, whatever that even means,
it means pretending that his religion makes sense in spite of all the evidence to the contrary.
Is better than, quote, pretending that the universe has no meaning.
Simply pretending the universe has no meaning at all.
This suggests, of course, that a person who doesn't adopt theism is merely pretending to be an atheist or a nihilist. And it smacks of a patronizing, I know that deep down you do actually believe in God, while suggesting that atheists, like myself, are somehow pretending, or at least engaging in self-denial. Think about it, how offensive would it be if I said, atheism is just the result of struggling with the logic of the universe, which is far more deep and meaningful than simply pretending that God exists. Not only would that misrepresent your position, Ben, but it would also suggest that you're lying, at least to yourself, and potentially to others, by only pretending to believe what you claim to believe.
I think that is evidently the case. The fact that he has to struggle with the logic of the universe implies that he can see that his views make no apparent sense, but he is telling himself that there is some hidden logic to them that one must struggle to uncover.
Is that what you're trying to accuse atheists of doing?
God, according to atheists, is an unnecessary hypothesis. The universe just is.
Don't theists believe that God just is? Why is the universe in any more need of a cause than God is?
We just are. There's no reason to search for a creator.
Of course there's reason to search for a creator. I mean, Ben, I'm essentially a professional atheist at this point, and my entire career has been an exercise in searching for a creator of the universe.
And my whole career has been based on searching for a coherent meaning to the claim that there's a creator of the universe.
An atheist is simply a person who is yet to find such a being, not someone who thinks that it's not worth searching. Indeed, many atheists are atheists precisely because they started searching for the God that they'd been told penetrates the entire universe and found absolute radio silence in response to their prayers and hardly any persuasive force in the arguments used to support his existence.
There's no reason to search for a creator, to posit that he cares about us, to suggest that there is some higher power that bridges the gap from what is to how things ought to be.
Even if there is a God, how does his existence solve the is-ought problem, if that's what Ben is alluding to? I imagine Ben believes that God is the ultimate authority of what ought to be, but what non-circular argument could there be for that?
Trying to ground ethics in descriptive scientific facts about the universe, or getting an ought from an is famously one of the greatest challenges of philosophy. Ben's correct that this is an extremely difficult thing to do on atheism, perhaps even impossible. But why would believing in God make the problem any easier?
Well, you see, you ought to do whatever God says. And why should you do whatever God says? Because God says so, of course. Checkmate, atheists.
David Hume is famously credited as a popularizer of the is-ought problem. He points out that to say something like, it is the case that racism causes suffering, therefore we ought not be racists, is an invalid inference. It doesn't follow. You can't derive an ought from an is alone. You need an extra premise, something like, we ought not cause suffering. Now the argument is valid, but as you can see, we're not getting an ought from an is anymore, but just an ought from another ought. So no matter how many facts we have about the way the universe is, we'll never be able to derive how we ought to behave.
Even if there is a God, there are no oughts that logically follow from this.
Now, Ben is suggesting that God can somehow solve this problem and allow us to derive an ought from an is. But why? Suppose we say something like, it is the case that God forbids murder, therefore we ought not murder. This too is invalid. We can't derive an ought from an is, so we need to inject an extra premise, like, we ought not do what God forbids. Now the argument's valid, but again, we're just getting an ought from an ought, still not an ought from an is.
And how do you justify the second premise? Why ought we not do what God forbids? Any moral precept grounded in God would make theistic morality circular. Any moral precept that can exist independent of God would be proof that moral precepts can exist without the need for a God.
You'll never be able to justify these extra ought premises by using is premises alone, even if the is premises are about God. You always have to assume an ought from the outset. Now, if I'm not allowed to do that with something like avoiding suffering, then why should you be allowed to do it with something like following God's commands?
Because God says so, duh.
Atheism often claims that religion corrupts mankind.
If you want to make good people do wicked things, you'll need religion.
That the notion of a God blinds men to the truths around them. That science is directly opposed to the idea of a creator.
Do you give them an A at least for trying to reconcile faith and reason?
I don't think they're reconcilable.
None of these things are true.
That was a little bit unfair. You used that clip of Neil deGrasse Tyson to make it seem like he was saying that, quote, science is directly opposed to the idea of a creator.
That science is directly opposed to the idea of a creator.
But if you watch the full interview, Neil is clearly saying that science is opposed specifically to biblical fundamentalism. Things like believing that the Earth was created in 6 days.
Even without that context, the clip shows Neil commenting on faith, not God. Even if you were saying that faith is incompatible with science, that's not the same as claiming that a creator is incompatible with science. If it turns out that the universe was created by some physical entity, using some physical mechanism, who exists in some other space-time continuum, such a creator could, at least in principle, be scientifically discoverable, because that concept of a creator would be compatible with naturalism and physicalism.
Not that it's opposed to belief in God generally. In fact, he specifically says that it's perfectly possible to be a religious believer whilst accepting the findings of modern science, and that it's the fundamentalists with whom science has a problem.
And so the educated religious people are perfectly fine with that. It's the fundamentalists who want to say that the Bible is the literal truth of God, and want to see the Bible as a science textbook, who are knocking on the science doors of the schools trying to put that content in the science. Enlightened religious people are not behaving that way.
Maybe Ben or his editor didn't watch that far into the interview.
They're saying, yes, science is cool, we're good with that.
Now listen again to what Ben implied Neil was trying to argue.
That science is directly opposed to the idea of a creator.
Which I hope you can see is not what Neil was saying at all.
Let's begin with the idea that God is an unnecessary hypothesis. It's difficult to imagine an argument in which God is utterly unnecessary. That is because all human logic is rooted in certain basic assumptions about the nature of the world and about reason that are completely unmoored from the dictates of evolutionary biology. First, we make claims of objective truth that exists independent of human minds.
Why does a God need to exist in order for that to be the case?
How does such truth exist? Based on the dictates of evolutionary biology, our ability to comprehend a truth should really be no more than our ability to think whatever is most evolutionarily beneficial for us and our genetic descendants.
I infer that my beliefs about mind-independent reality are true, but since my mind is fallible, that always leaves open the possibility that my beliefs are false. This is the case regardless of whether my brain was created by a god or by evolution.
But we don't believe that we think 2 + 2 = 4 because it's evolutionarily beneficial. We believe 2 + 2 = 4 always and everywhere because it's true.
But it's not true everywhere. It's not conceivably false, but numbers and arithmetic are inventions, and before they were invented, equations didn't exist and therefore could neither be true nor false. 2 + 2 = 4 because 2 + 2 is one way in which we have defined 4.
And that bespeaks a truth beyond the merely material.
No, it doesn't. Numbers are ideas, and ideas are things that brains do, and brains are made of matter. But even if it were the case that numbers were some kind of spooky, woo-woo Platonic forms, why would that be evidence that a god exists?
Ben's just presented an argument attributed to Alvin Plantinga called the evolutionary argument against naturalism.
Well, part of it. That's why he brought up that our brains evolved for survival, not for knowing truth. Plantinga further argues that we are undermining the strength of the theory of evolution if we say that our brains evolved for survival rather than knowing truth, because that implies that our belief in evolution is caused by a brain that prioritizes beliefs that help us survive over beliefs that are true. Therefore, we can't be very confident that the theory of evolution is true. One problem with this is that our brains produce perceptions that seem very much to be illusions, because they are inconsistent with what we can measure, like contrast illusions and the Ebbinghaus illusion. Plantinga argues that our brains are more likely reliable discerners of truth if they were made by a god, but if God created our brains to discern the truth, why did he make them susceptible to illusions like this? It seems much more likely that our brains were made in a way that optimizes our perceptions for survival rather than perceiving truth, and this seems to be the case whether a god created us or not, so how is theism a better theory than evolution?
If there is no God, and human beings simply evolved blindly by natural selection, then how can we trust our very ability to reason, to add 2 and 2 and get 4? Think about it. What does natural selection select for? Well, it selects for survivability. It doesn't select for truth. Now, of course, it could just coincidentally be the case that whatever's beneficial for our survival to believe also just happens to be true, but this seems incredibly unlikely.
Especially given that our brains don't seem to be telling us the truth a lot of the time. We seem to be pretty fallible. However, we are fallible whether a god created us or not, and evolution seems like a better explanation for that than being created by a loving god.
At least considering how many true things we claim to know, and how much room there is for such a process of reasoning to go wrong. Now, if we are entirely evolved creatures, then our reasoning faculty is evolved too, which means that our reasoning faculty evolved not to tell us what's true, but to tell us things that make us more likely to survive. So when my reasoning tells me 2 + 2 is 4, how can I know that this is true and not simply beneficial to believe for my survival?
Well, you can know that's true because it's true by definition. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.